Cártel de los Zetas es uno de los cárteles sin duda más sanguinarios en la historia de nuestro país.
Lascano era amante de los tamales, pero estos solía rellenarlos de carne humana procedente de sus víctimas.
In 2010, Heriberto Lascano, better yet known as the Executioner, broke away from the Gulf Cartel to head the formidable Los Zetas. Little did anyone see that bloodthirsty reign beginning, as Lascano didn't mind using exotic animals to torture his rivals. This is how cartels use animals to torture their victims.
The indictment filed in Chicago and several other cities today says the Chapitos made sure nothing and no one stopped the proliferation of their fentanyl ring.
In Mexico, they fed their enemies alive to tigers.
Drug trafficking has provided immense wealth for Los Chapitos, sons of El Chapo, maintaining their power through extreme violence and ruthless torture. According to a U.S. DOJ indictment, one of their most gruesome methods of execution involves feeding their victims to pet tigers. April 5, 2023, the brothers were indicted. This indictment detailed how Los Chapitos, Ivan Guzman Salazar, Alfredo Guzman Salazar, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, and Ovidio Guzman Lopez oversee the world's largest and most violent fentanyl trafficking network. Their faction of the Sinaloa cartel operates with extreme brutality, enforcing discipline and maintaining fear amongst rivals, law enforcement, and even their own members. In fact, the ranch in Navalato, Sinaloa, owned by Ivan Guzman, has been identified as a primary site for interrogations and executions. Victims brought to this location undergo horrific torture before being executed. According to the indictment, cartel sicarios known as ninis specialize in urban warfare and use various sadistic methods to extract information. Techniques including waterboarding, electric shocks, and using corkscrews to remove muscle tissue. Like in one case where a captured Mexican federal officer had his muscles ripped out before hot chili powder was poured onto his wounds and nostrils. He was then shot dead by Ivan Guzman himself. For those deemed useless or irredeemable, the fate could be even worse. Some victims were thrown into cages with tigers owned by Ivan and Alfredo. And as if that wasn't enough, the brothers deliberately kept the animals hungry, ensuring that executions were slow and excruciating. Witnesses have also recounted how some victims were still alive when thrown into the cages, and how they screamed as those tigers mauled them. Now, after these animals have dealt with these victims, cartel enforcers leave the bodies in black plastic bags on public streets, a clear message that non-compliance leads to death. The tactic, known as cleaning, is used to eliminate rivals and intimidate communities into silence. Even innocent civilians have been victims, forced to choose between cooperation or execution. Sicarios have been known to kill the children of those who refuse their demands before executing the parents. However, if you think these brutal executions stops at the torture and killing with animals, Los Chapitos have conducted large-scale violence to maintain their dominance.
The gun battles went on for hours as army and police forces came under increasing attack. Bodies could be seen in the streets.
October 2019, Mexican security forces arrested Ovidio Guzman Lopez in Culiacan. In response, the cartel launched a coordinated attack across the city, blocking roads, setting fire to vehicles, and engaging in gunfights with law enforcement.
The situation so out of control, authorities retreated and suspended the operation.
Faced with the threat of mass casualties, the Mexican government was left with no choice but to release Ovidio that same day to prevent further casualties. The incident, later referred to as Culiacanazo, demonstrated the cartel's ability to paralyze an entire city and even force the government's compliance. As a result of that, the U.S. government intensified their efforts to capture the remaining Chapitos. 2021, the State Department increases the reward for information leading to their arrest to $20 million. Despite this, the brothers have continued their operations, expanding their fentanyl trafficking into the U.S. Nevertheless, 2 of the brothers have been arrested so far. Back in January 5, 2023, Ovidio Guzman Lopez was arrested by Mexican authorities and extradited to the U.S., and Joaquin Guzman Lopez would be arrested in the U.S. in July 2024 after flying there on a private plane with El Mayo.
La Fiscalía General de la República en Jalisco cumplimentó una orden de cateo otorgada por el juez de control en el que aseguraron diversos animales silvestres.
April 22nd, 2023. Mexican authorities uncover a collection of exotic animals in La Barca, Jalisco, an area historically associated with cartel violence. Among the animals seized were 10 tigers, 6 jaguars, and 5 lions, along with other species including antelopes, a llama, deer, and birds. The presence of these animals have raised concerns that they're being used for intimidation, torture, and executions, a practice previously documented. The discovery came amidst ongoing investigations into cartel activities in Jalisco, home to the powerful CJNG. Known for their brutal enforcement tactics, they've been responsible for mass graves, public displays of mutilated bodies, and a relentless campaign of violence against rivals and government forces.
General de Jalisco confirmó que ya son 21 los cuerpos localizados y exhumados de fosas clandestinas en el municipio de La Barca.
November 9th, 2013. Investigators searching for 2 missing judicial officers uncovered 25 clandestine graves near La Barca, ultimately recovering at least 67 bodies. Many of the victims showed signs of possible torture with animals, with some found bound and restrained. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, led by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better yet known as El Mencho, has built a reputation as one of Mexico's most violent and powerful cartels. And it's not a cartel you want to really mess with. Originally, they were an armed faction of the Sinaloa cartel. The group would form later to counter rivals like Los Zetas, as well as to safeguard Sinaloa's interests. Since they came out in 2009 to 2010, they've expanded rapidly and operated independently, engaging in violent turf wars, even with their own Sinaloa cartel. Their arsenal may include grenade launchers, machine guns, armored vehicles, and, of course, exotic animals. 2011, one of the most infamous displays of CJNG violence occurred when cartel operatives dumped 35 bodies in Veracruz. The victims, identified as members of Los Zetas, had been tortured through various methods attributed to the cartel before being publicly displayed as a warning. The tactics of mass executions, either by gunshots or mauling by wild animals, and gruesome displays have remained a hallmark of CJNG operations. Now, aside from the mass killings, the CJNG has been responsible for some high-profile assassinations. December 18, 2017, social media personality Juan Luis Lagunas Rosales was murdered after insulting El Mencho in a viral video. Gunmen stormed a bar in Jalisco and shot this kid 15 times. In fact, they shot him up so much that Mexican authorities were only able to identify him by his tattoos. Despite multiple attempts to dismantle this organization, CJNG remains highly active. That's not all, though. The cartel's control goes into drug trafficking, extortion, and arms smuggling, solidifying their status as one of the most powerful and dangerous cartels in Mexico.
Escobar's ranch housed hundreds of exotic animals, including rhinos, elephants, and giraffes. For Colombia, it was a reign of terror.
It's December 2nd, 1993. Authorities are tracking Pablo Escobar to his safe house just a day after his 44th birthday, and they successfully execute him. While the victory was well celebrated, the extent Escobar had gone to torture his enemies would really shock everyone. Born December 1st, 1949 in Rio Negro, Colombia, Pablo Escobar was one of the most notorious drug lords in history, leading the Medellin cartel to unparalleled power in the 1980s and early 90s. His criminal operations weren't limited to just drug trafficking. He would brutally eliminate his enemies using exotic animals for torture and execution.
En 1978, Escobar y Gaviria compran una extensa finca en la región del Magdalena Medio colombiano, la Hacienda Nápoles.
Now, Escobar was rich, estimating at around $25 billion, and it allowed him to build this extravagant estate known as Hacienda Nápoles. Located in Colombia, the estate spanned 7,000 acres and featured artificial lakes, a bullfighting arena, an airstrip, and a zoo housing over 200 exotic animals. Now, many of these animals were illegally smuggled into Colombia aboard Escobar's drug planes. While Hacienda Nápoles was a symbol of his power and excess, it was also a site of horrific acts of violence. Reports would say that he used a collection of exotic animals as tools of terror against those who crossed him. Some victims were just thrown into these enclosures with hungry tigers and lions ready to maul them as a form of execution. Others were tied up and placed in the presence of these aggressive animals as psychological torture before being killed. Hippopotamuses, known for their aggressive nature, were also rumored to have been used as instruments of intimidation and violence. But Escobar obviously went beyond the use of his animals. One of his most infamous sayings would be plata o plomo, meaning silver or lead, and it gave the individuals a choice to choose a bribe or face execution. His cartel would carry out kidnappings, dismemberments, and assassinations to maintain their dominance. His victims would be government officials, journalists, and rival cartel members, often making an example out of all of them. November 27, 1989, the Medellin cartel orchestrated the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, aiming to assassinate a presidential candidate suspected of working against Escobar. The explosion killed over 100 people, and his war against the Colombian government would also include car bombings and targeted killings, contributing to thousands of more deaths. In one of his most infamous acts, he ordered the assassination of Luis Carlos Galán, a prominent presidential candidate advocating for extradition policies against drug traffickers.
It was a careless telephone call to his wife and 2 children on his 44th birthday that betrayed his hiding place. Escobar, who had the blood of hundreds on his hands, died almost defenseless, trying to escape across a rooftop.
December 1st, 1993, marked Escobar's 44th birthday, reportedly spent indulging in wine, cake, and marijuana, despite being one of the most hunted criminals in the world. However, just the next day, Colombian authorities had tracked him to a hideout in Medellin. As security forces stormed the building, Escobar attempts to flee across the rooftops. A firefight ensued and they found gunshot wounds in him. However, some people believe that he took his own life rather than be captured. As he always had said, he'd rather have a grave in Colombia than a jail in the U.S. Following Escobar's death, the Medellin cartel disintegrated, and many of its members were either killed or arrested. Hacienda Nápoles was seized by the government, and most of the exotic animals were relocated to zoos. However, some people, particularly the hippopotamuses, remained in the wild, leading to an ongoing ecological issue in Colombia.
Fiscalía de San Luis Potosí abrió una investigación por el hallazgo de 7 cuerpos semidesnudos y con huellas de tortura en un camino de terracería.
June 10, 2022. 7 bodies were discovered on a roadway in the Huasteca region of Mexico. The victims, all men, showed extensive signs of torture, and their remains suggested that they'd been eaten by animals before being killed. The bodies were found in the state of San Luis Potosí, near the township of Aquismón, though authorities believe they were killed elsewhere and later dumped here. That's not all, though. The bodies were found with writing scrawled on their corpses that read,
"This is what happened to me for working with the Gulf."
An apparent reference to the Gulf Cartel. The message was signed Valles Operation OB. The discovery reinforced the level of brutality that has long plagued the region. The Huasteca area, known for its waterfalls and tourist attractions, has increasingly become a battleground for cartels vying for control. In fact, just weeks before the bodies were found, former Gulf Cartel leader Mario Cárdenas Guillén was extradited to Texas on murder and drug trafficking charges. The DEA reported the cartel operated through extreme violence and intimidation to maintain control of their drug routes leading into the U.S. The presence of tortured bodies in the region sent a clear message that the fight for control was ongoing. October 29, 2022 brought another horrifying incident when residents of Monte Escobedo, Zacatecas, witnessed a stray dog running through the streets with a severed human head in its mouth.
Lleva una cabeza humana este perro.
The head had been left at an ATM booth alongside other body parts, accompanied by a message referring to some drug cartel. However, before authorities could secure the crime scene, the dog had already taken the head, and it was seen trotting down the street, gripping it by the neck. Police were later able to recover the remains. The incident pointed to the depth of cartel violence in Zacatecas. There's a key battleground conflict going on in Zacatecas between Sinaloa and the CJNG, with both these factions employing extreme violence. Both these cartels leave body parts everywhere with notes written on them to intimidate anybody. Months before, on April 1st, would be another gruesome discovery when authorities in Chilapa de Alvarez, Guerrero, found the mutilated bodies of 6 people inside an abandoned vehicle. The severed heads of the victims had been placed on the roof of the car, with another message warning against unauthorized criminal activities like drug sales, extortion, and theft. And they said the heads had bite marks on them, belonging to unidentified animals. A banner hung nearby also stating,
"In Chilapa, selling crystal, kidnapping, extortion, and stealing are strictly prohibited. This will happen to anyone who messes around. Capital punishment is the sentence for all these crimes."
The public display of the bodies served as a message to rivals and civilians, reinforcing their dominance. The Gulf, Sinaloa, and Jalisco New Generation cartels have been responsible for some of the most violent acts in Mexico's ongoing drug war. Victims are often subjected to extreme physical abuse before being killed. The use of animals in acts of torture is now not a new tactic amongst Mexican cartels, because other cases like wild cats and even pigs have been used to dispose of bodies. Now, Mexican authorities continue efforts to combat cartel influence somehow, but the sheer brutality of these groups ensures that fear remains a powerful weapon in their arsenal. September 2019, a man found himself in the hands of the cartel after being accused of sexual assault. Many assumed he'd be beaten, but what followed would be far more brutal. A graphic video pops up online showing this unimaginable form of punishment. The footage, which went viral, showed the accused stripped, restrained, and attacked by a dog under the command of his captors. The attackers, allegedly cartel members, carried out what they considered vigilante justice. The man, believed to be in his late 20s or early 30s, was accused of assaulting a young woman in his community. Despite her bravery in coming forward, local authorities reportedly did little to pursue the case, leaving it unresolved for months. With no legal consequences in sight, the cartel decided to take matters into their own hands. Under the pretense of a business meeting, cartel members lured this man to an isolated location where they set up a live stream for select viewers. When the broadcast began, it revealed a chilling scene. As the video played, they held this man down while a trained pit bull was set upon him. At first, the dog aimed for his throat, but they pulled him back and redirected to another part of his body, his groin. The man's screams filled the air. His desperate pleas for mercy met only with mocking laughter. One cartel member was heard taunting,
"This is what happens to those who violate women. This scum will never harm anyone again."
Now, the footage has been quickly removed, but clips have spread across social media. Short snippets made their way onto the mainstream, capturing the horrifying attack as the dog continued its relentless assault. Now, we don't know if he survived or not, but this case is just one of the deadly examples of cartel justice in Mexico. In places where the cops are pretty ineffective or unwilling to act, cartels often operate as an alternative authority, enforcing their own version of punishment. Many locals who are tired of this inadequate justice system turn to these groups for protection, even if their methods are pretty brutal. Now, this was just a warning. The attackers solidified their role as enforcers within this community. At the same time, it underscored the growing frustration with the police, which has struggled to address widespread violence for a really long time, particularly against women. In recent years, the country has seen a surge in protests against gender-based violence, with movements like the Glitter Revolution demanding action. Reports of femicide, assault, and disappearances are on the rise, while legal accountability remains scarce. When authorities fail to act, some communities do resort to extreme measures, but it just fuels the cycle of violence. Despite the brutality of that previous video, reactions were divided. Many around the world condemned the act, but some saw it as justification, believing that, in the absence of real justice, such punishments are the only deterrent left.
Cártel de los Zetas es uno de los cárteles sin duda más sanguinarios en la historia de nuestro país.
Lascano era amante de los tamales, pero estos solía rellenarlos de carne humana procedente de sus víctimas.
In 1998, Heriberto Lascano, known as the Executioner and Z3, deserted the military to join the Gulf Cartel's enforcement wing, the Zetas, where he quickly gained notoriety for his extreme methods of violence and torture. The Mexican Attorney General's office reported that Lascano owned a ranch containing a pit where he kept lions and tigers. He would capture enemies, informants, and those who defied the Zetas and throw them into these enclosures, left to be mauled and eaten alive. Some victims were bound and tossed directly into these animal cages, while others were severely beaten beforehand to ensure they were too weak to defend themselves. The use of animals as a method of torture wasn't limited to Lascano alone. Within the Zetas organization, it became a preferred execution method. Reports indicated that several of his rivals and captives were fed to crocodiles or large exotic cats. In fact, other victims would often be forced to watch before being devoured themselves. Under his leadership, the Zetas cartel expanded into one of the most feared organizations, with over 10,000 gunmen. Their influence ran from the Texas border deep into Central America. Their operations would include drug trafficking, extortion, human trafficking, and large-scale kidnappings. In addition to torturing victims with animals, though, mass executions have also become a defining characteristic of this cartel. Between 2010 and 12, the Zetas were said to be responsible for the massacre of 72 migrant workers in Tamaulipas, the incineration of 52 people in a casino in Monterrey, and the dumping of 49 mutilated bodies near a highway in Nuevo León. Many victims were tortured before death, with dismemberment, electrocution, animal mauling, and strangulation. The cartel would also make it into a public display if they have to, hanging mutilated bodies from bridges or scattering severed heads in town squares just to send their message. Aside from this, the recruitment tactics of the Zetas reflected their militarized structure. That's because Lascano himself was in the elite special forces. He would expand the cartel's ranks by enlisting former elite Guatemalan soldiers, known as cabiles, who had been trained in counterinsurgency and had committed human rights atrocities during Guatemala's civil war. These recruits introduced more sophisticated and ruthless tactics, further enhancing the cartel's ability to dominate its enemies. Despite that immense power, though, Lascano operated differently from other high-profile cartel leaders. Unlike El Chapo of the Sinaloa cartel, who embraced public displays of wealth, Lascano remained secretive. He avoided extravagant parties and luxury purchases, instead only focusing on expanding his criminal empire. It was that ability to maintain a low profile that made him one of the most difficult cartel leaders to track.
The government says these are pictures of the man who led the Zetas, Mexico's most brutal drug cartel. According to the Navy, Heriberto Lascano was killed in the northern state of Coahuila by naval forces on Sunday.
October 10, 2012. Lascano's reign of terror came to an end when Mexican Marines engaged in a firefight in Progreso, Coahuila. The operation, based on intelligence gathering, resulted in his death. However, in a bizarre turn of events, armed men later stormed the funeral home where his body was being held and stole his remains just hours later, after authorities reported their victory. Now, authorities claim they had confirmed his identity through fingerprints and other forensic evidence, but that incident leaves a little room for doubt.
La Fiscalía General de Justicia del Estado de México llevó a cabo un cateo en un predio en el municipio de Huixquilucan. Durante el cateo, las autoridades rescataron 47 animales, incluyendo 25 de vida silvestre y diversas especies exóticas.
April 6, 2023, authorities raided a ranch in Huixquilucan, west of Mexico City, and discovered a gruesome scene. The property was linked to a gang specializing in fuel theft and were housing 25 exotic animals. Investigators found out that these weren't kept just as status symbols, but were used as instruments of torture and executions. The discovery would expose a larger criminal operation. Alongside these animals, authorities found pumps used to steal fuel from pipelines, 14,000 liters of stolen diesel, and several large vehicles, including stolen lorries and buses. That's not all. 7 dead animals, some stuffed, were also discovered. raising further suspicions about the property's use beyond fuel theft. You see, many criminal organizations in Mexico have started to turn to petroleum theft as a lucrative revenue source, and brutal violence, including the use of these animals, has become a common method for controlling this black market trade. On November 17, 2022, a horrifying case emerges out of Oaxaca. Police respond to reports of a black dog roaming the streets with a human arm in its mouth. That led to investigators finding a dismembered body dumped on the outskirts of Oaxaca City. This reinforced the brutality of the cartel. Late October 2022, another case in Irapuato, Guanajuato, when residents found another dog carrying a severed human hand. An investigation's launched, and eventually, 53 bags of human remains were found buried in a makeshift grave. This all pointed to the war going on between the CJNG and the Sinaloa cartel. Guanajuato has one of the highest homicide rates among Mexico's 32 states, and has really become a battleground for cartel conflicts. Some of the violence has been tied to this fuel theft, but it's only worsening over the years. In fact, the U.S. Department of State has identified Guanajuato as a high-risk area, warning about the increasing number of cartel-related murders linked to petroleum and natural gas theft. And like the mass grave uncovered in Irapuato, the battle for control over these resources has resulted in mass killings, kidnappings, and public executions.